The rhetorical landscape of Washington combat has long been dominated by figures who rely on structural oratory to navigate institutional crises. For 3 decades, Hillary Rodham Clinton managed thousands of investigative leads, federal subpoenas, special counsel inquiries, and high-stakes congressional hearings without sustaining a definitive loss to her core political standing. She had successfully bypassed the intricate procedural challenges presented by senior lawmakers, utilizing a highly polished, load-bearing legal defense system designed to distribute weight evenly across her testimony. However, her established, institutional armor proved entirely ineffective during a 40-minute confrontation with Vice President J.D. Vance inside the Senate Judiciary Committee. This specific reckoning did not occur because Vance introduced newly uncovered compliance, irregularities, or unexpected policy critiques. It occurred because Vance executed a strategic maneuver completely unique in the modern history of legislative oversight. He bypassed traditional political arguments and simply placed her lifestyle directly adjacent to his own historical reality. FIDE. Structural parameters of the confrontation were absolute. Chappaqua, New York, placed immediately next to Middletown, Ohio. $750,000 international speaking fees contrasted with a civilian shoebox containing exactly $412, and high-dollar foundation galas juxtaposed with blocks of government commodity cheese. In the heavy silence that developed between those two incompatible American lives, and within the raw arithmetic of the spatial distance separating them, a national broadcast audience of 40 million viewers processed an answer to a fundamental question that required no explicit vocalization. The encounter established a vivid contrast between an official, worth an estimated $120 million, and a combat veteran who had emerged from a Midwestern trailer park. The assembly convened inside the Dirksen Senate office, building room 226, the exact legislative chamber where intensive structural inquiries had been directed weeks prior. Live national television feeds from C-SPAN, alongside split-screen presentations across every major network, monitored the proceedings. The public gallery had reached maximum capacity by 6 o'clock in the morning, populated by citizens who recalled that during previous sessions, the witness had successfully avoided the core baseline questions, and who had returned to see if she would provide a definitive accounting during this session. 8 minutes into her opening statement, Clinton was executing a meticulously structured address, each sentence functioning as a load-bearing element designed to reinforce her institutional perimeter. At the 9-minute mark, she shifted her focus from the committee at large, directing a flat, dismissive gaze directly toward Vice President Vance. Mr. Vice President, I have dedicated 30 consecutive years of my life to the active service of the public, Clinton declared, her vocal delivery finding the specific cold register she reserved for individuals she considered fundamentally beneath her station. A tone of professional dismissal rather than active combat. I have traveled extensively to 112 individual nations in my capacity as Secretary of State. I have negotiated complex international accords with heads of government on every single continent, and I have sat directly inside the Situation Room during high-stakes national security operations that members of this oversight committee do not possess the clearance to even discuss. And yet, I stand here today to be lectured regarding corporate and administrative ethics by an official who operated exclusively as a venture capitalist for Peter Thiel before he discovered an interest in domestic politics. She straightened her torso, her posture projecting total institutional authority. You did not grow up to serve the public interest, Mr. Vance. You grew up to write a commercial narrative about growing up, and subsequently, a Silicon Valley billionaire utilized his financial resources to manufacture your trajectory into the United States Senate. So, before you execute the opening of that folder, and I can perceive from this distance that it is remarkably thin, I would ask you to seriously consider whether an official who owes his entire career to a technology billionaire constitutes the appropriate authority to question a woman who has spent 3 decades in unyielding service to this country. The section of the legislative gallery occupied by majority staff coordinators reacted with an immediate, sharp exhalation of satisfaction. The reaction of an audience that had been waiting for a decisive rhetorical counterstrike and received it as the payment of an outstanding political debt. Yet the empirical reality underlying the narrative of public service carried its own significant metrics. Over the course of those 3 decades, the witness had accumulated a private net worth estimated at $120 million. She had not operated a motor vehicle personally since 1996, and she had not managed her own travel luggage since 1993. Her private real estate portfolio included 2 residential estates in Chappaqua, with a combined market valuation of $2.85 million. Her spouse had extracted over $100 million in global speaking fees since vacating the executive mansion, and their private family foundation had secured over $2 billion in total donations from international corporations, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals, many of whom maintained active business interests directly before her State Department. This was not the identical witness who had appeared during earlier legislative sessions. This version of Clinton had forensically studied the recorded footage of her previous interactions. She had watched her own physical micro-movements, observing the subtle contractions of her orbicularis oculi muscles and the visible flushing of her neck above the collar line, and she had meticulously corrected her physical presentation. Her hands were pre-positioned flat against the table surface, spread, wide, and locked firmly into place before the opening gavel fell. Her jaw was preset, and her water glass had been moved exactly 6 inches farther from her right hand than in previous hearings. A precise modification ensuring that reaching for the object would require an intentional, highly visible, and coordinated physical movement rather than a casual reflex. Because the movement would be visible, she determined she would not reach for the glass at all. Her armor was transparent precisely because it was entirely new, the body language of a seasoned political advocate who had reviewed the recording of a structural loss and arrived at the rematch insulated against every tactical maneuver that had worked before. Vice President Vance sat at the extreme terminal of the primary committee dais. He wore a dark, traditional suit with an open collar, his top button intentionally undone. His folder, a remarkably thin binder equipped with 5 color-coded indexing tabs, rested flat on the wooden desk before him. He had maintained absolute silence during her 9-minute address, executing no handwritten notes and remaining completely still. His hands rested on either side of the thin binder, palms down, his face bearing the expression of an analyst who was listening not merely to the literal substance of the words being spoken, but to the underlying psychological vulnerabilities being revealed by the delivery of the narrative itself. He slowly opened the binder, withdrawing a single sheet of printed text. "Ma'am, I appreciate your statement," Vance began, his voice carrying an unhurried, steady cadence. "You have provided this committee with an extensive description of 30 years of public service. Let me take a brief moment to describe precisely what 30 years of economic reality look like from the geography where I emerged." Vance turned a tab in his thin folder, extracting a second document. "In the year 2014, you participated in a high-profile national interview conducted by Diane Sawyer on ABC News, Vance stated, his eyes locking briefly onto Clinton before returning to the text. During that broadcast, you were questioned directly regarding your personal family finances after vacating the executive mansion. Your response was entered into the national record as follows. We came out of the White House not only dead broke, but in deep debt. He carefully aligned the printed transcript page flat onto the wooden desk surface. Dead broke. Vance paused, looking sequentially from the witness table to the committee dais, and finally toward the public gallery benches. His physical presentation carried no theatrical elements of a performance. He was actively engaging his personal memory, the perspective of an analyst traveling backward in time to an economic environment completely foreign to the surrounding chamber. Ma'am, I want to outline precisely what the definition of dead broke describes within the actual world, Vance continued, his cadence steady and deliberate. I am not discussing White House dead broke. I am discussing Middletown, Ohio dead broke. In my hometown, being dead broke means a family sits at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with exactly 2 postal envelopes positioned before them. Envelope number 1 is the monthly utility electricity bill. Envelope number 2 is the basic household grocery list. The mathematical reality dictates that you possess the financial capacity to pay exactly one of those obligations. You ultimately select the electricity bill because the calendar has reached February, and the residential plumbing infrastructure will freeze solid if the heating system deactivates. Then you walk directly to the storage cabinet to execute an inventory of whatever food remains. You locate a can of corn, a can of beans, and a block of government commodity cheese. The specific variety that arrives in an unbranded package the size and weight of a structural brick. You eat government cheese for dinner because dinner constitutes a meal that depends entirely on whether the adults in the household happen to be functional on that specific evening. And on many nights, they are not. His voice dropped into a lower register, carrying a distinct personal gravity. My grandmother maintained her entire personal life savings inside a standard cardboard shoebox, a Nike container, size 11, which originally held my stepfather's old footwear. Upon her passing, I forensically counted every solitary dollar concealed inside that box. The total sum was exactly $412. That constituted her entire life savings, ma'am. Everything she managed to accumulate across about 70 years of continuous existence on this earth. $412. Vance directed his index finger toward the printed quote resting on the desk. Let us evaluate the timeline subsequent to your statement. Exactly 3 years after you publicly asserted that your family was dead broke, you and your spouse maintained absolute ownership of 2 separate residential estates in Chappaqua, York, with a combined market valuation of $2.85 million. Your spouse was extracting a guaranteed $150,000 per individual speech. Concurrently, you had successfully finalized a commercial book publication contract valued at $14 million. Ma'am, an authentic, dead broke individual does not retain a professional speaking agency to manage their itinerary. A dead broke citizen does not possess a multi-million-dollar book advancement, and a dead broke family does not purchase a secondary residential estate next door for their armed Secret Service detail to reside in. He leaned closer to the microphone, his delivery sharpening. Dead broke describes a cardboard shoebox containing $412, a kitchen cabinet containing government commodity cheese, and an ordinary woman who executed labor her entire life and exited this world with less capital. than your husband extracts over the course of 9 minutes standing at a corporate podium. He pulled a secondary data sheet from the binder, a comprehensive analytic chart displaying two intersecting lines tracking economic trajectories across 2 decades. The specialized oversight staff has compiled a detailed comparative trajectory tracking private wealth. Line number 1 maps your estimated personal net worth trajectory from the year 2001, when you vacated the executive branch, through the year 2024. The data shows a progression moving from approximately zero, or what you defined as dead broke, to an estimated net worth of $120 million. Line number 2 tracks the median household income of the citizens residing inside Middletown over that identical historical duration. The metrics show a progression moving from $38,000 to $41,000. Over a 23-year timeline, your operation gained $120 million of private wealth. Over that identical 23-year timeline, the entire community of Middletown gained a net average of $3,000. Ma'am, that data does not represent a standard political comparison. That data represents an absolute systemic diagnosis. The pre-positioned, anchored hands of the witness, the hands she had deliberately locked into place, flat against the table before the opening gavel, to insulate her presentation against any unchoreographed micro-movements, shifted instantly. Her right hand slid slowly over the top of her left, her fingers interlocking tightly. This movement did not mirror a gesture of casual contemplation or prayer. It functioned as a physical covering. It was the defensive reflex of a body seeking an alternative configuration in which both hands could be hidden behind each other, because any other physical placement, spread flat, reaching, or gripping, had been forensically identified during film review as a severe vulnerability. The interlocking was exceptionally rigid, causing her knuckles to whiten by a distinct shade. While the physical adjustment was too subtle for the distant gallery rows to process, the high-definition C-SPAN close-up camera captured the tension perfectly. 40 million viewers processed the non-verbal disclosure. The witness, who had meticulously armored herself against every vulnerability exposed during previous hearings, was discovering that Vance was not deploying his attacks against the same operational weaknesses. Vance turned to the third indexing tab within his folder, reviewing his data sheets with clinical focus. Let us analyze the specific operational structure of your families. Speaking fees, ma'am, he stated, his tone remaining entirely flat. Prior to your appointment to the Office of Secretary of State, your spouse's standardized international speaking fee was maintained at approximately $150,000 per engagement. During your active 4-year tenure, as the head of the State Department, spanning from 2009 through 2013, those corporate fees quintupled. His standardized fee escalated to $500,000 per individual speech inside the Russian Federation, and reached $750,000 for a solitary hour at a podium inside the People's Republic of China. Concurrently, the exact international organizations and corporate entities that were paying your spouse to deliver these addresses were transferring substantial financial donations directly into the Clinton Foundation. In total, your spouse extracted at least $26 million in personal speaking revenue exclusively from entities that maintained active, high-stakes regulatory business directly before your State Department. He paused, letting the raw math settle over the chamber. $750,000 for a solitary hour of speech. Inside the municipality of Middletown, the median annual household income is $40,000. A single hour of presentation executed by your spouse equals exactly 18 years and 9 months of continuous, full-time labor for an ordinary working family in my hometown. The structural weight of that specific metric does not function as abstract data. It functions as a physical mass inside this room. Every single citizen monitoring this broadcast possesses the capacity to divide their own annual salary into $750,000, arriving at their own personal version of that duration. And every individual version of that number is completely devastating to the narrative of public service. Vance adjusted his glasses and focused back on the data log within the third tab. Let us evaluate precisely who was transferring these massive pools of capital, he continued, reading the records at an accelerated tempo, deliberately omitting any conversational commentary between the names, so that each data entry functioned like a distinct exhibit in an audit. The banking conglomerate UBS, subsequent to your direct administrative intervention on their behalf with the Internal Revenue Service, their financial contributions to the Clinton Foundation escalated exponentially, moving from $60,000 to $600,000. Concurrently, your spouse extracted $1.5 million in direct speaking fees paid exclusively by UBS. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Federal Republic of Germany, the Commonwealth of Australia, the United Arab Emirates, alongside dozens of multinational corporations actively pursuing high-dollar procurement contracts with the United States government. He lifted a secondary dossier from the evidence stack. An independent forensic analysis conducted by the Associated Press evaluated your official State Department calendar throughout your 4-year tenure. Their investigators concluded that out of 154 private individuals with whom you scheduled discrete meetings, exactly 85 of those actors had collectively transferred $156 million directly into the accounts of the Clinton Foundation. Furthermore, official investigative records finalized by Senator Chuck Grassley reveal a highly irregular operational pattern. When field agents within the Federal Bureau of Investigation attempted to initiate formal public integrity investigations into these exact financial relationships, the foundation donations, the speaking fees, and the absolute overlap with State Department actions, they were systematically blocked. Senior leadership within the Department of Justice under the preceding administration repeatedly intervened, issuing direct administrative orders instructing field offices to stand down. Prosecutors were explicitly denied support from the public. Integrity section, Vance cited directly from the unredacted case files. A senior federal prosecutor wrote verbatim in his internal log, "There appear to exist profound conflicts of interest for the senior leadership at Maine Justice regarding the active 2016 Clinton financial investigations." Concurrently, specialized investigators were systematically blocked from accessing critical electronic evidence discovered on peripheral hardware connected to your inner circle. The primary evidence was intentionally redirected, the case managers were sidelined, and the inquiry was terminated. Ma'am, let us ensure the committee possesses absolute clarity regarding the structural pattern. Your spouse's professional speaking revenue quintuples during your exact tenure as Secretary of State. 85 of your private consultation. Partners collectively transfer $156 million to your private family organization. Corporate contributions escalate tenfold following your direct regulatory intervention, and when the professional law enforcement agents whose constitutional mandate is the investigation of precisely this type of pattern attempt to execute their duty, they are ordered to halt. Senator Kennedy previously characterized this system as complex political architecture. I will deploy a term that is significantly simpler. In the town of Middletown, when an entity transfers a massive financial payment to your family, subsequent to you assisting them with the federal government, we do not define that transaction as a speaking fee. We do not define it as philanthropy, and we do not define it as a foundation donation. We call it a price. And when law enforcement attempts to investigate the mechanics of that price, and an official instructs them to stop, we call that something else entirely. Vance did not articulate the legal term. He stepped aside and allowed the silent atmosphere of the Dirksen room to supply the conclusion. Clinton's neck underwent a slow, involuntary transformation, the skin flushing with a deep warming as blood flow increased rapidly to the surface, a biological reaction that could not be masked by professional cosmetics. Her facial makeup, which had survived the intensive structural scrutiny of previous hearings without a visible flaw, terminated at the jawline, leaving her neck entirely unprotected. And the human neck, unlike the face, cannot be instructed by executive discipline to maintain a specific color. It responds automatically to blood pressure, heart rate, and the autonomic nervous system's subconscious assessment of an active threat. This subtle flush, running from the collar of her jacket to the base of her ear, was captured with absolute clarity by the upward-angled high-definition broadcast lenses, signaling to 40 million viewers that the narrative was bypassing her carefully rehearsed defenses. Vance turned to the fourth indexing tab within his thin binder. "Ma'am, let us analyze the deletion of 33,000 electronic mail files, but let us execute this review entirely outside the standard talking points of Washington politics. I have zero intention of discussing server encryption protocols, data wiping software, or the technical components of the records. I want to discuss the actual life of an ordinary citizen named Ray. Ray resided inside Middletown. He operated a standard forklift at a commercial logistics warehouse on Bro Mar Boulevard, a facility that originally functioned as an auxiliary supplier for the Armco Steel Corporation before the manufacturing infrastructure exited the region. To supplement his primary wages, Ray operated a small local lawn mowing enterprise, managing 3 hourly employees and 2 standard riding mowers. He managed his corporate books personally utilizing a yellow legal pad, precisely how working-class citizens manage accounts when they lack the capital to retain a professional accountant. When the Internal Revenue Service initiated a routine regulatory audit of Ray's lawn mowing business, not for intentional fraud, ma'am, but for a simple filing irregularity, Ray panicked under the structural pressure. He made the conscious decision to shred his financial ledgers, not classified national security documents and not top-secret diplomatic correspondence, but the paper receipts for a local lawn mowing service utilizing 2 riding mowers. Ray was immediately charged with the obstruction of a federal regulatory investigation. He was convicted inside a federal court, and he was sentenced to 14 months inside a federal penitentiary. His spouse executed a manual commute every Saturday to visit his facility, and his local business collapsed entirely. Subsequent to his release, the warehouse downscaled his hours, and he currently operates as a courier for commercial delivery applications. Vance paused, letting Ray's history sit heavily inside the room. That is the story of an ordinary man who destroyed the wrong documents and paid for that error with 14 months of his physical liberty and the total destruction of his livelihood. Now, let us place your administrative decisions directly adjacent to Ray's reality, ma'am. On March 4, 2015, the House Select Committee formally issued a binding legal subpoena instructing your operation to surrender all electronic mail correspondence from your private server infrastructure. Between March 25th and March 31st, exactly, 3 weeks subsequent to the issuance of that legal mandate, a specialized contract technician utilized an advanced data deletion program to permanently erase approximately 33,000 emails from your hardware. Those files included extensive communication chains containing top-secret intelligence, the highest classification tier assigned by the United States government to protect national security. 8 individual chains were validated as top secret. 36 were confirmed as secret. The technician subsequently informed investigators he sustained a sudden realization that he had omitted to execute the deletions months prior, and therefore executed them immediately after the subpoena arrived. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation publicly defined your administrative management of classified secrets as extremely careless, yet he declined to recommend criminal charges, opting instead to conduct a national press conference. Ray destroyed paper receipts for a lawn mowing business and secured 14 months in a federal cell. You permanently erased 33,000 files under an active congressional subpoena, including top-secret national security intelligence, and you secured a national press conference. Ray could not afford elite defense counsel. You retained David Kendall. Ray went to a federal penitentiary. You went on an international book promotional tour. The underlying difference between your situation and Ray's is not the density of the empirical evidence. The documented evidence against your operation is exponentially more extensive and public than anything contained inside Ray's case file. The difference is not the law. The statute applies identically to both citizens. The definitive difference is the zip code. Vance turned the final tab within his binder, his voice dropping into a direct register that felt less like a formal congressional query and more like a conversation at a kitchen table. Let us evaluate one more metric regarding things that cost ordinary citizens significantly more than they cost your operation, ma'am. In the year 2022, your presidential campaign organization and the Democratic National Committee collectively paid a $113,000 fine to finalize an investigation conducted by the Federal Election Commission. The inquiry concluded definitively that your campaign had intentionally misreported millions of dollars in spending on political opposition research, capital that directly funded the production of the Steele dossier. That exact dossier was subsequently utilized by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to secure specialized FISA surveillance warrants to spy on an American citizen. $113,000. That was the financial penalty for funding a fabricated document that led directly to the federal wiretapping of a United States citizen based on allegations that Special Counsel Durham concluded your campaign knew were entirely unsubstantiated. Ma'am, $113,000 represents exactly 3 full years of Ray's hard salary at the logistics warehouse. Ray secured 14 months in federal prison for shredding lawn mowing receipts. You secured a minor administrative fine for funding a fraudulent dossier used to spy on a citizen, and you paid that fine the exact same way an ordinary person pays a transient parking ticket before moving on to your next corporate engagement. He shifted his gaze over the legal text, looking directly at the witness. Now, I want to tell you about an ordinary woman named Mrs. Henderson. I'm going to omit her first name on this public record because she never tolerated strangers utilizing her first name. She considered the practice far too familiar, and she considered most individuals in this capital to be strangers. Mrs. Henderson executed labor inside the primary cafeteria of the Armco Steel Mill in Middletown, Ohio, for 31 consecutive years. She served lunch to the workers, meatloaf on Wednesdays, chicken on Fridays. She maintained an absolute baseline knowledge of every single steelworker by name. She addressed them all as honey, every solitary one of them, and not a single worker ever attempted to correct her because when Mrs. Henderson called you honey, it meant she had made an administrative determination that you were an individual worth feeding and that constituted a major local compliment. Mrs. Henderson officially retired from her position at the age of 74. She retired exclusively on her federal Social Security allocation, exactly $847 per month. She possessed 0 international foundations, 0 corporate speaking fees, 0 multi-million-dollar book advancement contracts, and 0 residential estates in Chappaqua. She maintained a modest, one-bedroom apartment on Corwin Avenue with a standard kitchen table where she consumed her dinner entirely alone because her spouse had passed away in 2009. And her children had relocated to Columbus because the local manufacturing factories had closed and there were no longer any viable jobs remaining in Middletown. Mrs. Henderson served the actual public for 31 years, ma'am. She served the men who physically manufactured the steel that built the structural infrastructure of this nation, and she retired with $847 a month and a silent kitchen table. Vance tapped the folder with his pen, his cadence slowing to a mathematical pace. You also served the public for 30 years. You traveled to 112 countries. You negotiated with heads of foreign states, and you sat inside the Situation Room. And you retired with an accumulated private wealth of $120 million. Your family foundations secured over $2 billion in total donations from corporations and foreign states that maintained active regulatory interests directly before your State Department. Your spouse extracted over $100 million in global speaking fees, revenue that quintupled during your exact tenure as Secretary of State, paid exclusively by entities seeking favorable administrative treatment from your agency. Your daughter resides inside a $10.5 million apartment in Manhattan. 3 weeks ago, Senator Kennedy asked you directly to identify who protected you, who made sure you were never held accountable, and you declined to answer. A month prior to that, you sat for 6 continuous hours of legal depositions and answered, "I do not recall," to 34% of the questions put to your person. Today, I am not going to ask who protected your operation, and I am not going to ask what your memory retains. I am going to ask a question that is significantly simpler. Mrs. Henderson retired with $847 a month after serving meatloaf to steelworkers for 31 years. I grew up consuming the free school lunches and the government commodity meals that women like Mrs. Henderson served. Those meals physically kept me alive during the years when my mother was entirely dysfunctional. The women who managed those kitchens were authentic public servants, though they never utilized the phrase. They called it work, and they retired with nothing but a basic monthly check. Ma'am, my question is about pure arithmetic. In 30 years of public service, you accumulated $120 million of private wealth. In those identical 30 years in Middletown, my neighbors accumulated absolutely nothing. Their factories closed down, their children succumbed to addiction, their homes lost all baseline market value, and the public servants who were mandated to represent their interests got remarkably rich while they got entirely forgotten. Who exactly were you serving? The question hung heavily over the Dirksen room across 12 full seconds of absolute, unbroken silence. The protective armor that Clinton had meticulously constructed subsequent to her previous hearings, the pre-positioned hands, the preset jaw, the calibrated physical parameters designed to withstand any standard political attack, encountered a question it was structurally incapable of absorbing. Her defenses were built to manage accusations regarding systemic procedures, partisan investigations, and historical allegations. Her legal team was fully prepared to redirect those inquiries into a rehearsed 3-minute commentary regarding political architecture. But Vance's question was not about the administrative system. It was about the raw mathematical space separating two incompatible American lives. The distance between $120 million and a $412 shoebox. Clinton's eyes closed slowly, not the rapid, casual blink of a public official maintaining composure, but a deliberate, extended closure that lasted for 2 full seconds. 4 times the duration of a standard biological blink. It was the physical reflex of a visual cortex requesting a total suspension of incoming data to process a structural calculation. When her eyelids reopened, her expression had receded entirely. The waterline of her composure remaining intact but moving significantly farther back, like a tide withdrawing from a shoreline that can no longer be defended. Her defense counsel's pen remained tightly capped, his legal pad completely blank, because mathematics is an empirical reality that no legal advocate can defend inside an oversight chamber. The wealthy remain silent regarding the source of their assets, the exact same way the guilty remain silent regarding their infractions, Vance concluded, slowly closing his thin, color-coded binder. Not because they lack a verbal response, but because any response they articulate will reveal the reality of the transaction. From the geography where I emerged, from the kitchen table where I sat as a child, wondering if the domestic electricity would remain active through the night. The arithmetic indicates that you were serving yourself. Mrs. Henderson served the workers. You served your operation. The difference is exactly $120 million, and that number constitutes the definitive answer to the question. The institutional and structural fallout from the 40-minute audit accelerated, with massive velocity across the Capitol. Bipartisan congressional majorities successfully passed a formal referral to the Department of Justice, instructing federal prosecutors to evaluate the Clinton Foundation's decades of financial transactions under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act, the heaviest legislative instrument deployed against their operation in 30 years. Concurrently, the State Department officially revoked her residual national security clearances, citing the historical findings of internal investigations regarding the systemic mishandling of classified files and effectively placing the former secretary in complete institutional exile from the architecture of power. Moving image segments tracking the 12 seconds of silence and the extended biological blink were distributed across digital networks over 34 million times in less than 18 hours, reframing the 30-year narrative of public service as a simple class-based equation that crossed traditional partisan lines. The Clinton political dynasty, a structural feature of American life since 1992, entered an indefinite administrative pause, leaving the operation confronted with a document-backed record that could no longer be bypassed through oratory.